Hello there, it is April 24th, 2016. My name's Greg Cape. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm doing a video today about tax issues and public banking, and I'd like to discuss a few tax issues at first. Okay, there's a number of people are getting irate about getting taxed too much in our contemporary, especially if you're middle class and you're paying property taxes and you're paying income taxes taxes on capital gains if you happen to own stocks, so which are taxed less. So anyway, I'll get into the income tax. Okay, this year and last year I got taxed around 700 or so for between federal. I got taxed like 250 for federal, and then like 380 something, or I don't know. It's like it's anywhere from 600 to 700, or it's like 700, a little over $700 I got taxed for. I got taxed like 250 on federal and 400 something on more than 400 something on state of Oregon taxes. So the state of Oregon, I believe, is using our taxes for welfare payments. And they're also using them for services. This is what I got a letter from saying that, okay, we'll give you, says here, okay, well, they're going to give me a refund on what I gave them. I gave them like close to 400, and then they gave me a refund back on that. And they said here that this money I gave them goes to provide services. Wait, what exactly does it say? It says maintain services to improve the quality of life in the state of Oregon. So I'm going to assume that it's possibly for welfare too, because a lot of people around me are on welfare because the unemployment rate's still really high. It's like 22.5 roughly. So a lot of people are on welfare, especially the people who go in for therapy. They're required to. Some of them are on welfare. So my tax money is going to support welfare payments, and it says down here, it kind of like hints at like, hey, if you want like free health insurance, you can get it through the state of Oregon. So our taxpayer money is paying for a lot of things, not just welfare, but road payment, road work on state highways, things like that, state public works projects. So anyway, yeah, that's what I've seen so far. And my income's kind of low. It's like a little over 19,000. That's not too high. So the taxes have gone up since I moved to Bend, at least, and my income, it's risen a bit, but it's not that high. I mean, I used to make anywhere from like, 12 to 13,000 a year when I was, living on the edge, so to say, in Michigan and New Jersey. So this is a step up, yes, but it's still, we're getting taxed quite a bit. And people are irate over this. They don't want to get taxed too much because, and there's a way to get around these taxes. And I'll explain that later. But the other thing that is making people frustrated is the Bend gas tax. They had a special election in Bend that they paid extra money to do in, or I should say, let's say, I'll describe this in detail. It's the city of Bend in Central Oregon is where I live. And we have a gas tax that they wanted to impose on us. They had a special election in March to pass this gas tax, and they paid extra money to have this election. So that got people very angry. Because they're using taxpayer dollars for that, and then they tried to convince people that we need this gas tax to support road work, and they deliberately did not repair the roads, so this way they would maybe hope that it passed that way, and so and they're still crying and saying that like we don't have the money for this, we don't have the money for this. There's places to grab money from. I mean, they can grab it from Bend Parks and Recreation, they can grab it from other spots. Where money's available. They can also put a tax on the people who live in the massive McMansions on Aubrey Butte. They could put extra taxes on them if they have to. I mean, the real elites like make money off of capital gains, so they don't get hit by the income taxes that I get hit by and that everyone else gets hit, middle class gets hit by, because they make money off of stocks. So we don't have that many financial elites out here in Bend, Oregon, as you would say, in, let's say, near New York area, but you still have some financial elites. So that's where the elites make their money at. So they kind of get around it. They also put their money in treasure islands offshore, which does not help the American people. It stays offshore. It doesn't, do much of anything. Well, it does do something. It just it doesn't get taxed as much is why they do it. So anyway, so we have that. And so people are very angry at this, and there's a way around this. I'll describe that in one moment. Let me just open up my window real quickly just because it's kind of hot in here. Okay. So And so the thing is that people don't want to support the people who are on welfare, and they also don't want to support this gas tax. And Americans in general don't like taxes at all. Like, I mean, we're a very people want to practice fiscal responsibility here, or they kind of preach it, but they that's why people voted Republican for so many years until they realized, like, oh wow, the Republicans and Democrats are the same thing. You're both going to get a bad deal with either way you go. So anyway, yeah, so people are angry at this, and rightfully so, because I don't want to get taxed, $700 every time my income tax is due, because it's a lot to pay out, and so I mean, I'm willing to pay some money out. Don't get me wrong. But I'll describe this in detail. Okay, so we have these two tax issues that I've noticed people are angry about. Okay, and I have a solution for this. Okay, it's we can have a public bank in the state of Oregon. Okay, what we could do is we could it's like this. Public banking is not so well known in the United States, and I'll just describe briefly how it works. Okay, so basically it's like this. You have like, let's say a public bank will do this. It will take everyone's deposit and it will charge low interest on them because it can afford to do so. It works as a public utility rather than a predatory, too big to fail bank. It works for the public interest. So they would charge low interest loans to individuals like me and around Bend, Oregon, and Oregon in general. They would just put out loans, low interest loans too. They wouldn't be high interest. What the bank could do is it could take the interest it's charging on these loans. It could then use that interest to then offset taxes, and it could lower the taxes all around Oregon. Okay, so that's one thing they can do, and that's what the Colonial Bank of Pennsylvania did in the 18th century. The Quakers started a Colonial Bank in Pennsylvania, a public bank, based on similar principles to what most public banks are built off of. And the only taxes the colonists of Pennsylvania had to pay was an excess tax on liquor, which is fine. I'm okay with that because I don't think people should be drinking too often. So they did that, and that worked out very good. That's one example of a public bank. And then I'll bring up the Bank of North Dakota later, but for now, let's just stick with what public banking, what the solutions are, basically. It's like, okay, so the state of Oregon, okay, what the state of Oregon could do that it doesn't do, okay, the state of Oregon right now can't deposit its money into a public bank because there is no public bank. So it has to deposit its money in a private bank. And I'm talking about pension funds for the state of Oregon. I'm talking about taxpayer dollars and public works projects money that's set aside. Okay, that money gets deposited into a private bank, from what I think I know. And I have done some research on this that shows that, yes, they do. Because you think about it like this, there are no public banks except for the Bank of North Dakota in the United States. So where are they going to park their money? They have to put it in a private bank. They have no other choice. Okay, so when that happens, the bank, if the state of Oregon was like, hey, we would like our taxpayer dollars back immediately. We'd like to be paid in full on them. The state of Oregon, I mean, the private bank that has all of our taxpayer money is not going to be able to cough it out immediately. They're going to be like, no, this money, and they're going to laugh at us and be like, no, it's going to be a bad laugh too, because the money's invested in other deposits, it's invested abroad. It's invested in other investments that had nothing to do with the state of Oregon. So that's what the private banks are doing with state taxpayer money sometimes, for the most part. It's not all available at once, and it's invested in other places. That's a big problem, and they have to stop that. They can't do that because that's very predatory. I mean, this is taxpayer money we're talking about here. You shouldn't have a private bank doing what it wants with taxpayer money. So that's one thing that would come to an end with a public bank. And another thing is that, okay, when loans get created, a private bank and even a credit union creates only the principal when they create a loan. They just create the principal for every loan they make. So as a result of that, you have a Ponzi-like structure being formed, because to pay back a loan, you need principal and you need interest. Okay, so banks have to keep on extending loans to people to keep the Ponzi scheme going. Otherwise, the Ponzi scheme collapses. And that's part of what happened in 2008 and 9 in the United States and the world in general. That's part of the cause of the financial crisis. But it's more complex than just that, as everyone is, I'm sure, aware of. What a public bank would do is they would charge either no interest for loans, or they would charge very low interest for loans to get around this this Ponzi-like structure that's created by creating just interest on loans. So so that's one thing that a public bank could succeed at doing. And I'll show you an example of that. Okay, so you have, let's say the bank, you have a public bank on the one hand, and you have a state public works project. Both of these are owned by the state, okay? So the state doesn't need to charge, the public bank does not need to charge the public works project high interest on the loan it's taking out to create a public works project. They could charge them no interest on the loans even, and the loan would be extinguished after it's been paid back. It would just vanish, you know, and it would work really well. And so it's you could do that, and you could that's what the state of North Dakota does. I know this one guy in Bend who I talked to at my job pumping gas and car wash. I work at a gas station and car wash, and he said, yeah, I'm going to North Dakota to work on roads, and so I thought to myself, oh, you're probably working for the state of North Dakota. I didn't say this, but I assume that he's probably working for the state of North Dakota building roads, and they're using the public bank over there, and private banks too, by the way, to create money off of, to fund these public works projects. And that's what we could do here in Bend to solve the road problem, is have a public bank, fund it with public bank money rather than taxing everyone excessively. And same with the welfare thing too. You don't need to do that. You don't need to tax people. You can tax them less, much less, with a public bank. Those are some of the solutions I have. It works pretty good. Public banks are used mostly. They're very popular abroad. There's only 2 examples here, as I stated before: the Colonial Bank of Pennsylvania, and that one no longer exists, and then the Bank of North Dakota, which still does exist. Now, what I think happened in the United States is that they, of course, repressed this information from getting out and telling people how public banks work. And I know this to be fact a little bit, at least, because based on earning my BA, I took one class on, this is a class on government and business, okay? And this is a book by Richard Linné. It's a good book and all, but it doesn't really, it tells you that Japan has state-run capitalism, but what they don't tell you is how the keiretsu works, which is a public banking structure that you have a public bank that helps support state-run conglomerates and or companies. That's how Japan works state-run capitalism. This book tells you literally like nothing about how a public bank works, and maybe it's because it's designed to be government and business, but you'd think they would mention something about that, but they don't deliberately, because public banks are a secret and they want to keep it that way. They don't want to tell anyone how they work, because people would figure out, oh, we should all have public banks everywhere, and people would rebel against the current private banking model. That's why they're press information. So, and the other thing about having the only public bank in the United States located in North Dakota, I think that the too big to fail banks are okay with that, because it's, first of all, North Dakota's in the middle of nowhere, okay? People aren't going to pay much attention to it, and so I'm sure they're okay with that, and so that's one of the reasons why they let this bank exist. It's a small state, and it's not well known. It doesn't get in the news, and they do not put the public bank in the news at all either, deliberately, because they don't want people knowing about this. And so that's one thing. They'll sometimes do this occasionally too. The Federal Reserve, would have meetings. They'll do things in the middle of nowhere, and they'll do important things in the middle of nowhere. This is sometimes how they do things. They would have, like, the Federal Reserve had a meeting 2011 in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and of course, no one. They did that deliberately in the middle of nowhere, so this way no press, hardly any press would show up. They do things like that occasionally. They put, like, that's why they allowed the Bank of North Dakota to exist. It's the thing about it. It's in the middle of nowhere. No one pays attention to it. So that's one reason why it's still there, because why they haven't totally destroyed it yet. And the other, I'd like to bring up one more solution, or one more detail about public banks. So the public banks can work with private banks, because you could have them underwriting the loans that private banks issue. So they don't exactly dominate the scene. They're not going to come in and just destroy all the private banks. There's still going to be private banks available. They're just, I don't think in the future there should be too big to fail banks available, because they're predatory and not working with the public interest. So these are one solution. And on one final note, like let's say, okay, the this is how how a bank of, let's say, State Bank of Oregon would work, like a public State Bank of Oregon would work. I'll give you an idea. Okay, so a bank right now, all a bank is doing is taking everyone's deposit and loaning you back your own deposit at interest, which is absurd. It makes it sounds absurd because it is absurd. So that's what they're doing basically. But what a public bank can do is it not only will take your deposit, but it will also take all the taxpayer money in there. It won't invest the taxpayer money abroad like the private banks are doing right now, and it won't gamble with your gamble in derivatives with your taxpayer dollars at all. And the other thing is it could take that massive taxpayer base and it could make loans off of it. It can make loans to individuals and it can make loans for public works projects. We could have more infrastructure in the state of Oregon. We have a lot of sinkholes right now in Oregon that need to get fixed, in the valley at least, not over here in the rain shadow side of the state. But in the valley, we have sinkholes occurring on roads. We have things that need to be fixed. And so that's one thing that it will do. And when the banking regulatory agency called the Bank for International Settlements comes around, and they say, okay, now how are you creating all these loans in the state of Oregon with this public bank? Where's your reserve requirements? Well, the public bank of Oregon can say to them, well, we're making loans we're calling on all the taxpayer dollars and all the deposits we have from individuals to create loans off of, and that's our reserve requirement, because the BIS regulates reserve requirements for banks. And so you could just throw it right in their face and be like, hey, haha, we got it set basically. We don't need to worry about reserve requirements when we have taxpayer dollars to call on. And that's a lot of money, taxpayer dollars, to create loans off of. So you could make a lot of credit off of that. So these are some solutions towards to creating a more stable banking model. And so it's a win-win for everyone. And I'd like to bring up one final note, is that I'm kind of like an anarchist, or like maybe you could describe me as a leftist. So, but I'd rather prefer to call it libertarian socialist in the European fashion, the European term. So one argument I could bring up as being a libertarian socialist is that this bank, this is one con, let's say, is that, and people might get this is how they'll trick people into not passing it too. They'll be like, even though public banks I know for a fact work, they could say like, okay, state, politicians might run the bank, or no, the people who run the bank or state employees might, try to do something like pork barrel politics and passing legislation for one's constituency and then milking the bank for money. And that's one thing that could happen. So that's one argument against it, but that probably won't happen because a lot of the public banks have been very successful. And they work pretty well. They're not going to, they're stable pretty much, except for when you have like, what's the word for it? Except for when you have basically the public getting. One way in which they've been defeated and why people don't know about them is because the private banks have tried to dominate the scene. Basically, they have. In America, let's say our central bank is based off of the Bank of England, okay, and that's the model that the Rothschilds and the elites want all over the world. They want that same model everywhere, and you see this model everywhere. You see this model in the ECB, in South Africa, in mostly the Western world. In Japan, you have two competing interests. You have the Bank of Japan, which is based off of our Federal Reserve and/or Bank of England, and you also have the Ministry of Finance, which is what I'm trying to get into, which is like a state-run capitalist model using public banks. And so that's basically like it. That's why that's why you don't see public banks at all, or you don't see too many public banks here in the United States, because they took over this country. The private banks took over, and you don't see them in too many Western nations because they took over. So that's what they did. But you do see a lot of public banks all over the in abroad too. And a book that describes public banks both domestically and abroad is this book. It's called From Austerity to Prosperity: The Public Bank Solution. It's by Ellen Brown. Okay, it's a really good book. I suggest you read it. She also has a website called Web of Debt. And she has a book called Web of Debt too that I haven't read yet. But this book is really good. I really recommend this book for everyone. It's a great book. It tells you how public banks work and the history of public banking. So I will let all of you go, and I hope you have a good day. All right, take care.